when I mentioned conflict, Gaza is a perfect example of how it destroys the infrastructure, it disrupts the food supply chains. And then when populations are already dependent on humanitarian aid and that aid is no longer able to flow to those populations and the populations can't migrate and move anywhere, then yes, that's a very good example of how conflict is leading to increased malnutrition.
You're watching The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Joining me today from Carmel, Indiana, is Dr. Heather Stobaugh, Associate Director of Research and Innovation, Action Against Hunger. And we will be discussing the state of food security and nutrition in the world 2025, a sort of global report card on hunger levels, food inflation impacts, and the cost of healthy diets worldwide, which was just released a couple of days ago. This video will be available to members only in early August and a week later to our regular subscribers. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Stobaugh. I appreciate
for having me.
Thank you. So let's take it right from the top, Dr. Stobaugh. What were the sort of primary drivers of global food price inflation between, I think your report spans from 2021 all the way to 2024, and how did that affect food security worldwide?
Yes, no, it's a very good question. So during this time period, there was a combination of multiple factors that increased the price of food globally. One, the war between Ukraine and Russia had a major impact. So both of these countries are major exports of wheat, corn, oil, and even fertilizers. So when Ukraine's ability to produce and export was cut and Russian exports were sanctioned, it caused an acute food shortage in many countries, particularly in North Africa, that were dependent on imports from Russia and Ukraine. And so when you have a shortage, it drives the food price up. Secondly, there were generally just higher fuel costs. Partly this is in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic. And when energy prices rise, including fuel, the cost of transportation and shipping of food products and even food processing does drive the price of food up. And in the aftermath of COVID-19 in general, supply chains were disrupted. There was labor shortages, logistics challenges, and all of these things were causing disruptions to markets, which can drive the food price up. And then lastly, during this period, we had several climate-related shocks, extreme weather events, such as drought, particularly in the Horn of Africa, disrupting crop production and causing a shortage of food supply, which also increases the cost of food.
Mm-hmm. While most of us know that mostly it's usually women and rural communities and children, of course, who are particularly vulnerable to any sort of, crisis or emergency usually. But in this case, which groups were most affected by the recent surge in food prices? And why are women and rural communities particularly vulnerable?
So generally speaking, lower income households, the poorest households, are most vulnerable because they spend a larger share or a larger proportion of their income on food. This could be, 60 to 70%. So they don't have much extra income to absorb the price increases. And that results in them implementing coping strategies, so reducing the number of meals, switching to lesser expensive food, which can often be less nutritious food. And then conflict affected populations around the world, displacement disrupts livelihoods, and damaged infrastructure can also make populations then especially dependent on food aid because the normal food supply chains are disrupted. And then in general, children under 5 require consistent access to nutritious food for not only their proper growth and development, but they have less energy stores in their body. And so when there's a restricted intake or there's less food intake, this is when we see the immediate consequences of child stunting or wasting or the micronutrient deficiencies. So those are kind of generally populations that are most vulnerable or most impacted by food price increases or food shortages. And you mentioned women in rural communities, and these are also vulnerable populations. Women, they're vulnerable due to just a lot of inequity in society and some social norms, and then also economic disadvantages too. So women and girls typically eat last in some cultures when food is scarce, and that can then lead to them consuming less if there's not food. Women often have less income generating abilities or lower income, and so they just have less income to be able to spend on food. And the other one that a lot of people, I think, don't often realize is that women are the primary caretakers, usually, of children and elderly relatives, and it's their responsibility to feed more than just themselves, and so that increases their burden during a food crisis. Um, and rural communities, remote locations often have poor infrastructure, and that can make food more expensive and harder to access. They have less market access in general. Rural farmers rely on inputs, farming inputs like fertilizers, fuels, and when those become unaffordable, it it just makes access to food and the price of food that much more challenging. Urbanites don't have these issues with their livelihoods as much. Yeah, so those are some of the vulnerabilities among different populations.
When we're talking, about rural populations, does that include rural populations in so-called developed countries as well? Or is it just sort of underdeveloped nations?
I think it's both, but there are more buffers in higher income countries. Most of these effects are felt at a greater magnitude in lower resource countries.
hmm the report I noticed talks a lot about, effective sort of policies that need to be put in place in order to, mitigate the impact of food price inflation. But what do you think are the most effective sort of fiscal or trade policies which countries have used already
Mhm.
to sort of mitigate the impact?
Yes, like you said, there are a lot of policies and actions that can be put into place. Generally speaking, the actions or the programs that are targeted to the most vulnerable or the poorest household tend to be the most efficient and effective. So targeted food subsidies or targeted cash transfers that are directly to the poor. And some other policies that are sort of proven or have a good track record of being effective, sometimes temporary reduction on taxes on food and fuel. So, for example, I think in 2023, Indonesia removed its tax on cooking oil. So that lowers the burden of inputs to food. Other things like subsidies on agricultural inputs, these can be quite effective. Um, Countries like Malawi, Zambia, and India expanded their fertilizer subsidy programs over the past few years to and to help lower that burden of cost for inputs and food production. Something that is often quite popular from a political stance, but it can have mixed effects, are like the import export policies. Um, they can have positive impacts in one area, but then some negative impacts in another. So, for example, in 2023, India temporarily restricted rice exports. And this had a great benefit within India because it controlled the domestic price of rice. However, it creates a shortage globally, and it does increase the global price and has a negative impact on other countries that are import dependent. So it can be effective in some areas, but it might be considered something that has mixed impact or mixed results.
Since you brought up India, the report notes that there's a sort of significant improvement in affordability in India, which has sort of, in fact, skewed the sort of findings of the report in many ways. What factors contributed to this trend, and can it be replicated elsewhere?
Yes, it's a good question, and India is a really interesting case. So the government of India put in place multiple actions that really had a big impact. So, for one, the government has a massive a public food distribution system, and so they distributed either subsidized or even free food grains to some 800 million people, and this really buffered the poorest from the food price spikes. And it ensures that families can consistently have adequate amount of food. Secondly, the government managed large food buffer stocks. So maintaining strong buffer stocks of commodities like wheat and rice, it can help to stabilize the market price. So they can release stocks and not release stocks to help control the supply, which in turn helps stabilize the price. And then that also provides a consistent supply for that public food distribution system that I mentioned. Um, Third, they did provide fertilizer and input subsidies. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this helps reduce the costs for farmers to grow crops, and it avoids passing that increased price of inputs through to the food consumers. And that can help food prices be lower at the point of retail. And then I mentioned earlier the export restriction on rice and wheat, which helped to keep the prices domestically down. So,
Yes, but it's saying that
um,
it impacts negatively elsewhere.
yes, but it did help within India. So this is why we see, India standing out as a country case study where they didn't have the same amount of food price shocks as other places in the world. Um, And you asked if this could be replicated elsewhere. India's approach has been very resource intensive, and it's backed by large government, both capacity and the ability to provide large subsidies. And so that type of approach is going to be much more difficult, if not impossible, in a lot of other resource constrained countries that are feeling a lot of the impacts of increased food prices. So for these other countries that have lower resources, as I mentioned earlier, the more targeted social safety nets, such as like the cash transfers or the food distributions targeted towards poor households, are more realistic to help buffer the poorest households from the increased food prices.
You know, let's stick to India for a bit more time because, in the report, it says that despite some progress in reducing child stunting and wasting and anemia rates, um, India seems to be primarily the large number of, children are stunted or they have wasting and anemia. Is that again due to social constraints or are there other factors involved?
It's a combination. The causes of malnutrition, particularly in children, are multifactorial. So it could be a lack of adequate food intake, right? Just restricted food intake. That could be one source, but it could also be not having a diverse nutritious diet. We call that dietary diversity. So having the full range of all the micronutrients and macronutrients at the levels that requires the optimal growth at critical time points. And there could also be, sanitation or hygiene issues that might allow for exposure to illnesses, pathogens that would cause illnesses. And some of those critical illnesses can actually cause some nutritional deficiencies by, not allowing for those nutrients to be absorbed or those nutrients to pass through the body without being absorbed. So it just having enough quantity of food isn't necessarily going to be enough to have a fully nutritious, fully healthy population that is growing in their younger years.
I suppose that would include stuff like water, drinking water capabilities and
Exactly. Clean water. Exactly.
hygiene as well. As you mentioned, hygiene
hmm
makes a big difference
hmm
because you fall ill if you don't wash your hands and stuff.
Exactly.
But do you see any? I mean, is India the only country where there is this problem, or what are the other countries where you have this problem in a large way?
Oh no, India is not unique. There are multiple countries that are very much struggling to meet the 2030 nutrition targets. A lot of these issues, um, are driven by the low resource constraints that they have, and conflict, as I mentioned earlier, that disrupts things, and illness outbreaks, cholera, etc. There are multiple factors. It's not just India. There are a lot of countries that are in fact struggling to improve the nutritional status of their populations.
You mentioned conflict that would mostly, apply to, let's say, countries in Africa and just like that, right?
Yes, it could be. There are multiple conflicts around the world. A lot of them are constrained in Africa, but not completely restricted there. Yes.
So, I mean, I don't suppose you could apply this to, let's say, the Gaza Strip. That's a different case altogether, or Ukraine, where there are major conflicts going on.
No, it would absolutely apply there. To your point, there are unique circumstances in both of those contexts, but we do see Gaza, for example, extreme food insecurity, and pockets that have been projected to have famine, because it is that combination of restricted food intake, poor hygiene and sanitary conditions, and outbreaks of illnesses. And that combination does cause increased risk of malnutrition and morbidity. And with regard to a place like Gaza, a lot of that is because of the restricted access. The humanitarian aid is not able to reach those populations. So when I mentioned conflict, Gaza is a perfect example of how it destroys the infrastructure, it disrupts the food supply chains. And then when populations are already dependent on humanitarian aid, and that aid is no longer able to flow to those populations, and the populations can't migrate and move anywhere, then yes, that's a very good example of how conflict is leading to increased malnutrition.
And again, it would be mostly, the first victims of these would be women, children, the elderly.
Exactly. They're the most vulnerable.
So we're almost running out of time, but I just wanted you to sort of give us an idea. We have just 5 years left to achieve the 2030 nutrition targets. And I'm a layman, but I don't really see us achieving these targets I mean, globally at least. But are there any sort of urgent steps which sort of the global community has to prioritize to reverse this trajectory? Are they? What would you recommend, or what does the report recommend that we do?
Yes, it's a good question, and I do think it's a lofty goal, but there's no better time for us to double down and drive towards the achievement of that goal. So, first and foremost, I would say there's the need to scale up proven nutrition interventions. So, the World Health Organization has a list of evidence-based nutrition interventions that they even call essential, because we know that they're high impact. These include things like vitamin A supplementation for children, multiple micronutrient supplements for pregnant women, therapeutic foods for children who are suffering from wasting, and they're not that expensive. So if governments and organizations can invest in these and scale them at large, then we will see improvements in the nutritional status of populations. One way to help scale up, which is going to be my second recommendation, is integrating nutrition into healthcare systems. So currently, nutrition services tend to be siloed. Like they're often separate from mainstream healthcare. But by embedding nutrition activities like nutrition screening for malnutrition, breastfeeding counseling, even treatment for malnutrition, by embedding those activities into the primary healthcare systems, you boost coverage. You increase those services to the populations dramatically, and you also improve the continuity of care between the nutrition services and other health issues that might be going on. So I would say lastly, and probably most importantly, is there does need to be an increase in domestic and global donor financing towards issues around malnutrition. 2025 has seen massive decreases in funding towards global health, food security, and nutrition programming. If we even want a chance at improving our trajectory towards the 2030 nutrition targets, we must increase both the global and national level budgets for these sort of nutrition sensitive and nutrition specific types of programs. If we don't, not only will we stagnate, we may actually go in the other direction and see things like child mortality and child malnutrition go up instead of down. So the investment needs to be there.
Since we still have a couple of minutes, let me ask you a question that's bothered me for a while. Whatever little study I've done on this, particularly in India, but I suppose it applies elsewhere. How big a factor are social norms, social and religious norms which are patriarchal in nature, where sort of women are sort of sidelined and they're said that, you eat after we do, or I know a lot of culturally also we have those things here. My understanding is that the politicians don't want to get into that, or even the NGOs, because that would involve a lot of thinking change, and that is difficult to do in a short period. How big a factor is that when it comes to malnutrition, particularly for women?
That's a very good question. And I would say it depends on the context, but it can be a very big contributor to malnutrition. And one of the areas that this plays out particularly is what we call complementary feeding. So when a child is born, they ideally are breastfed for 6 months. And then after this, we might call them weaning foods, or there's lots of different phrases for it, but complementary feeding is the introduction of semi-solid foods and foods. And here is when there's a lot of cultural practices that can come into play that can disrupt a normal child's growth or an optimal growth and development. We see things like some cultures will say a child needs to be breastfed for a year and a half before they can eat solid foods. Well, that's not going to bring enough calories for them. Or there's certain foods that they will restrict from a child because there's some cultural belief that it will have a negative impact. And yet if they don't have that food, they end up having micronutrient deficiencies. So there's a lot of these types of things. And to your point, behavior change is very, very hard, especially when it comes to raising children, right? Because the stakes are very high. Mothers take that very seriously. The cultures are very embedded. So one of the things that ministries of health or aid organizations, even academic researchers look to are different ways that we can fortify foods that are commonly consumed. So this can be like large scale fortification where we're putting in more micronutrients than a food would normally have. Typically grains or cereals, that's commonly. And then there's also where you can target specific foods and say, like, there's a rice that we're going to put more vitamin A in it because we know that's something that's causing a lot of deficiencies. So those are some other tactics that we can do to try to kind of get around the behavior change because that's so hard, but it does help to bring those critical nutrients that children need during those developing years.
Hmm. So, last question: how confident are you that we might just be able to hit these targets? These 2030 targets. Because I personally am a bit cynical about it, but I mean, you might know better.
No, I think 2026 is going to be very telling. If we don't see a reversal in the funding cuts, and meaning instead of having restricted funding, we now increase that funding and double down on our investments in nutrition and food security and global health. If we don't see that happen, I think it will be very challenging for the world to meet those targets. If we do see increased investments, then we will at least have a shot at moving in the right direction.
Hmm. Well, that sounds cautiously optimistic, if you ask me. I
There
mean,
are
because
caveats, but we do need to see some things
it's
take
not,
place. Yes,
particularly with people like President Trump sort of cutting money left, right, center for everything, not just social work, but so it does make a difference. I mean, you do need finances to matter. With
exactly.
that, and uh, sorry, but I must call this interview to an end. I appreciate you taking time out and putting this whole report in perspective for us, and I look forward to having you with us again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. That was Dr. Heather Stobaugh, Associate Director of Research and Innovation in Action Against Hunger, talking to us about the State of Food Security and Nutrition report. It was 2025. It was just released a couple of days ago. And from what I could understand, she remains cautiously optimistic, but with, of course, certain caveats in place. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to having you with us again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.